This is Brainy Podcasts with Soraya Shaw and Tracy Filler, inspiring creativity and innovation through evidenced neuroscience. Welcome to episode 18, which we have titled The Art of the Four-Day Week. And this is becoming quite a big topic as we start to look at companies moving away from hybrid working or reevaluating the way that they have their teams interact and communicate. And to help us navigate quite a big conversation, we're delighted to be joined by Dr Charlotte Rae. She's the senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Sussex and specialises in psychological and biological foundations of wellbeing and workplace performance. So jolly glad you're coming along to join us on this ride, Charlotte. And I think where I'd probably like to start is your research, which started in 2022, where you were looking at the four-day week. I think it's called the Four-Day Week Project, and looking at the impact that that has on businesses in terms of productivity, but also employee well-being. So seems like the most appropriate place to start.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tracy. Yes, so I set up the Sussex Four-Day Week study in 2022, originally as a scientific study, because I wanted to understand more about the journey that staff were going on when they switched to a four-day working week. I'd seen the media headlines about both better well-being, but also better performance. And as a psychologist, I just really wanted to understand more about what was going on inside the head that was behind those media headlines. But over the last 3 years, it's really become more than just an academic research study. Of course, we've got all these fantastic research insights that have been coming out, but it's been a true collaboration with those employers who have gone on that journey and their staff as well. So we've learned a lot, not just about how does it improve mental health, how does it improve brain function, how does it improve productivity, but also about some of the practical steps that people take in order to shift their work about and ensure that the business still operates.
The businesses that you engaged with to support the studies, can you tell me a little bit about them? Are there any sort of size of companies? Are there any commonalities in those that found this at a study that they wanted to be part of?
Yeah, so quite a lot of diversity in terms of employer size. We have solopreneurs all the way through to tech companies with 250 staff. But nevertheless, a little bit of a trend there in that most employers we've worked with tend to have 20 staff or fewer. And the national trial that ran in 2022 and which studied 60 employers had a very similar trend as well, where really we've seen this being driven particularly by the smaller businesses. And I think that's for a number of reasons, but one key reason that I've observed is that there's really high trust and communication and reciprocity between the business owner or the team leaders and the staff. And there's just this really strong buy-in on all sides and to pitch in and make it work. Because the staff recognise, wonderful as all the wellbeing side of things are, the business still needs to operate. And that means they need to contribute. They need to make an effort themselves to identifying changes in working practices that will enable fantastic outputs, fantastic service with less time on the job.
So we're talking about fewer hours or compressed hours. How are they typically approaching that four-day week?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question to clarify because there can be a little bit of confusion. If you've read about the four-day week in the media, sometimes different terms are being used or different concepts of what that means. What you've mentioned, the compressed hours model, that's where you do the same total number of hours, but you just distribute them slightly differently through the week so that you might perhaps switch from doing 5, quotes, standard length days to 4 longer days. So here you're shifting work about, but you're not actually changing the total amount of time that you spend working. That contrasts with what we call working time reduction. So that is where you actually reduce the amount of time that you spend at work, but you keep your original salary. So that might be where you are originally working 5, quotes, standard length working days, and you drop down to 4 standard length working days. And the kind of 4-day week that I've been studying, that I use the phrase 4-day week to apply to, is that working time reduction model. And that's the model that was studied in the national trial of 2022 as well.
Do people then, when you're talking about working time reduction, does that reflect in people's salaries as well, or?
No, so the idea is you retain your original salary.
Okay.
So we've got a third bracket here to define as well of part-time working. So that's where you work less than a
full-time
contracted working week, but you also take a salary hit to do so.
Okay.
So Andrew Barnes, who's an originator of the 4-day week concept, this was what first piqued my interest in the 4-day week. He ran the 2018 trial in his own business, Perpetual Guardian, and he thought it was so fantastic he wrote a book about it, which podcast listeners, I'm waving to Soraya and Tracy. And Andrew describes this model as a 100-80-100 model. So 100% of the output in 80% of the time for 100% of the salary. That contrasts with compressed hours, where we're looking at 100% of output or performance in 100% of the time for 100% of the salary. And that contrasts again with part-time working, where you're working, say, 80% of the time, 80% of the performance, 80% of the salary.
Oh, nicely explained. Thank you. That's a good clarification. And of course, it starts to merge. My head's dancing around, obviously in the UK, and I appreciate we have listeners from all over the world, but we have something called the flexible working request that we're allowed to have under our UK employment law.
Yes.
Where does the 4-day week request fit in under that?
So there is official government guidance on this, and it's relatively brief, and we can get the link for listeners to put into show notes. And under current UK legislation, to support employees to request flexible working adaptations, which they can now do from day one of a new job, you can request to distribute the same total number of hours differently throughout the week. That could be compressed hours 4-day week, or it might be 7 shorter days. But under the current government legislation, there is not an option to request a reduced hours 4-day week remaining on your original salary. It's only the compressed hours model that is currently listed under the definition of a flexible working adaptation that your employer is legally required to consider. They're not actually legally required to grant it, just to have the conversation with you.
I think it's really important we've clarified what can and can't be asked for, and where and how it might impact your experience as an employee, but as importantly as an employer as well, in your appropriate and legal responses. Certainly if you're in the UK. Obviously can't talk. I think we've got 27 countries listening to us as we record.
I think so, yep.
So we obviously can't speak for every single country, but that's certainly the UK law. I suspect that's quite similar to Europe, which will grab a fair few of our listeners, but we are North America. It will be very different, which is where we get a lot of listeners, and Asia Pacific. So now I've taken myself off my own thoughts. I'd like to understand, because I know that parts of the research is you actually, which is where we get excited with neuroscience, is being able to study what's going on in the brain.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about what the studies, what's been found in the research so far, the change in the brain?
Yeah, so we've been using MRI brain scanning to look at how brain function might change when staff switch to a 4-day week, and that's a reduced hours 4-day week. And I wanted to do that because I had seen these media headlines about people feeling subjectively healthier and happier, and also them performing better at work. And the three of us chatting here today, we all know that where does work come from? Comes from the brain. We see the outputs of the brain in terms of, say, documents produced or, clients cared for, but all of those outputs and that service, it's produced by the human brain. Whether you're a marketing executive or a bricklayer, it's your brain doing all of that work. My previous background is I looked at the neuroscience of mental health, and clearly we could already see before we even started our study that the 4-day week was doing something for that for people. So what we do is we take an MRI scan on week 1 of the trial when they've just switched to the 4-day week, and they come to us on their newly free 5th day for an MRI scan. And that's so that we're not encroaching on work time too much to come and visit us. And then the staff do the reduced hours on a weekly basis for a period of 12 weeks, and then we scan them again to see what's changed. And over that time, on a weekly basis, we're doing a short check-in questionnaire with them, and we can see week by week burnout coming down, and we can see positive mood going up, negative mood coming down, sleep problems coming down. Literally week by week by week, there's a steady improvement. And alongside that, we also see a steady improvement week by week in productivity and in work engagement. That's how enthusiastic and motivated you feel. So we know that this workplace intervention is doing something for people in terms of how they're feeling and in terms of how they're behaving at work. So there must be a brain basis to that. And our interim results so far have already highlighted a couple of really interesting mechanisms at play. So firstly, when we think about the time that people are spending at work and how they're getting on with work, what we're seeing in the brain is that there's a change in default mode network connectivity after 12 weeks of being on the new working schedule. So what is the default mode network? It's the default mode that your brain goes into whenever you're not engaged in an attentionally demanding task. So, for example, think about sitting on a train and looking out of the window, or perhaps going for a lunchtime walk as a break during your lunch hour. And during this brain state, your brain is literally creating physical headspace for creative and problem-solving thoughts to come to the fore. And the particular regions of the brain that are activated, particularly along the midline, the medial prefrontal cortex and the medial parietal cortex, a region called the precuneus, we know that these regions are associated with creativity, with problem-solving. And fascinatingly, we see that the connectivity between these regions of the default mode network increases after the 4-day week. And this aligns with the subjective experience that staff tell us they experience on the 4-day week of that time away from the desk helps them with things like how to have a difficult conversation with a colleague or how to solve an early analysis problem. And so giving yourself that protected time away from the day-to-day tasks that we're busy with in the time that we're on the job is incredibly important for engaging that default mode network. And what we can see is the 4-day week's improving that.
It's my favourite network. I know it sounds a stupid thing to say, and we talk about it quite a lot actually on Brainy podcasts, because especially getting people to just even have a kind of 10-minute rest during the day, yes. The brain is then in default mode network and Absolutely. It's making new connections. And I think it's also it's the network, as you talk about creativity, which is why so many people have wonderful ideas in the shower.
Absolutely.
Because it made those connections while it's your kind of task-focused part of the brain is switched off. And that's where all the best ideas come from.
Yep, certainly that's the case for me. I often have to jump out of the shower and quick grab my phone to write down my next piece of scientific analysis. Also cycling. Yeah. For me, it's in the shower and cycling where you're kind of a bit on autopilot in terms of some repetitive movements that your brain isn't having to think too hard about. Just a little tip while we're thinking about it for people.
A lot of people hate that writing a presentation or a document, and it's that blank sheet of paper. If you just write 3 or 4 words on it about what you're trying to talk about and put it in a drawer, I guarantee you when you come back to that piece of paper, you will be able to write it because your brain will have rested and thought about it and put it together. So that's just a tip there.
Well, Soraya, you haven't mentioned that for a while, but we always say your brain just needs to have the right question.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll work on it for you.
And you did your natural dive in and sort of shared on that, because I was just about to say, again, for the benefit of the fact we are just on podcasts and not on video, that your grin as Charlotte was describing the default mode network was beautiful. And it was just a lovely way of describing it and slightly different to how we've perhaps covered it. So that was hugely beneficial. And what it also put me in mind with is the conversation we had with Alison Pittaway as well, not so much about dropping hours, but in terms of the time coming back from utilising AI for those repetitive tasks and how that
whilst we've not done the studies around that, how that's starting to have the same impact. And we were talking about the connections that then makes to being better at critically thinking and coming up with ideas. So that came back to my head a little bit as well as you were talking through that. I don't know whether, you've got anything around, I know it's not covered in your study, but whether there's been any fringe discussions or benefits around the technological advancements as well as perhaps how people are using their hours.
Yeah, absolutely. There has been some work done on this. So the Autonomy think tank have done a dedicated piece of analysis on how could AI enable a 4-day week? And they've actually calculated what percentage of the UK workforce could have a 4-day week by 2030 if AI was fully made use of to find those efficiencies. And it came back with approximately 30% of the UK workforce.
Wow.
Could have 20% of their time freed up by 2030. And they did a kind of sister piece of analysis for Canada and for the US as well, and came back with similar statistics. And certainly use of new adoption of new technologies is one of the practical steps that we see our 4-day week employers experimenting with, and then using the time that's been bought, those efficiency savings, to give that back to the staff for the rest time, and then all of the benefits that then brings back to them being at work, in terms of the brain being able to better engage.
What I also picked up on from the last piece of conversation where you were explaining the studies and how you tracked the brain change, 12 weeks doesn't sound like a very long period of time to see such dramatic shifts in brain activity. And I'm just wondering how that manifests itself in behaviour.
Yeah, so we picked 12 weeks because we had seen in Andrew Barnes's original 2018 trial, he piloted it for 8 weeks. And the measures that he took, he didn't have brain scans, but he was asking staff how they felt in terms of well-being, and he was looking at performance. And 8 weeks was enough to change how people were feeling, in them saying, I've got better work-life balance, I'm feeling healthier and happier. And he took a number of performance metrics. Just to give one example, it was managers' assessments of how their teams were doing. So we knew that 8 weeks was probably enough to change how people were feeling and behaving at work, at least to a degree. But we went for 12 weeks just for that little bit of extra insurance buffer, because we also thought maybe it takes a little bit longer for it to fully evolve. And one of the pieces of preparatory work that we do with employers before they switch is thinking about what are the adaptations that are going to need to be made to the working week in order to get more done in less time. And AI is only just one strand of that. A lot of this is actually around behaviour change, team interactions, and kind of psychological approaches to your routine and working day. And we know from chatting to employers that it does take a good few weeks for those new routines to really bed in. And I always encourage employers and the staff themselves to have a little bit of an experimental mindset, that it is going to take a little bit of experimentation and tweaking as they're going along week by week, piloting and working out, okay, we changed up how we were doing this about meetings and that's working well. We changed how we were doing this about our messaging platform, that hasn't worked so well. Okay, we're going to try this next. And we can see in the workplace metrics that we take on a weekly basis, that week by week evolution, where they don't ramp up to better productivity overnight. It takes several weeks to build. But nevertheless, 12 weeks is enough for us to see statistically significant improvements on these measures that we're taking. And on the interim data that we have so far from the MRI brain scans, we can see a brain signature of that. We want to get the sample size up to start asking some more interesting questions around sort of subgroups and managers versus staff. It's striking just how powerful the changes can be in only 12 weeks.
But that kind of makes sense when you think about neuroplasticity, and that you need to be making those new connections and reshaping, if you want. I wonder, though, how much brain health, as we know, is now being talked about, and brain capital and how important it is. And this is something we've kind of covered on our podcast. But I wonder whether, because people have got more time, they are doing more exercise. You were talking about cycling. or cooking better, having a better diet, or sleeping better, all those kind of hygiene factors and life factors that can make such a difference to our brain health.
Yeah, absolutely. And we explicitly wanted to look at that because we thought that might be one of the mechanisms at play. So we've been asking people about their diet, we've been asking about how much exercise they're doing, and we've been asking about their sleep. Very interestingly, we can see statistically significant improvements in sleep, both slightly longer sleep duration and better self-reported sleep quality. But it seems like there isn't a major shift going on in diet and in physical exercise, at least from the data we've gathered so far, which really surprised me because I thought we would see all three of those changing. As you said, Soraya, we've given people more time to prepare food, spend more time preparing food if they want to, or to do exercise classes. And in some employers, we have seen on a sort of employer level some of those metrics changing. But when we add all the employers up together, we haven't seen a massive shift in those two other lifestyle elements.
Interesting.
Yeah, but we know that the sleep is really important because another piece of analysis we've done is looking at how much someone's performance improves when they switch, and relating that to how much their well-being has improved. And we can see a very strong correlation between the more that someone's sleep improves, the more their productivity goes up.
Yeah,
because logic would tell you that that's what would happen, but isn't it great that the science is backing that up?
Yeah. Well, I do find it interesting that people aren't the exercise though, because we know exercise is so important for neurogenesis and connectivity. All of it is really, really important. But I wonder if that was because their baseline of exercise is quite good anyway, because you are in Sussex, you've got lovely countryside, and people by and large are quite healthy, aren't they?
Yes, the population that we're studying, because they're working full time, yes, they're time crunched, but generally they have a higher baseline level of quotes physical health than some other groups who might be working part-time or fewer hours or perhaps even unemployed. So I think you're right that probably plays into it. There's also the fact that in terms of where people have distributed the working time reduction, the vast majority of people have gone for the 4-day week model with a complete day off. We have said to people, if you want to do a slightly different model of shorter days, then that also sort of meets our criteria of a meaningful reduction in time at work with no loss of salary, that 80-100 model. But the vast majority have gone for that concentrated day off. And so that means you've potentially got an extra day to fit in an exercise class. But we know that good cardiovascular health comes not from just doing a short burst once a week, but actually keeping on top of it throughout the week, and doing some short bursts more frequently can sometimes be more helpful for maintaining cardiovascular fitness. Yeah.
I would love to carry on down this route, and I don't want to mellow our mood a little bit, but the studies started under quite a different economic climate. And again, at the time of recording, we normally avoid anything to do with politics because it does date the podcast quite quickly. And also, we really don't want to be too political. We want to be more with the science and human behaviour. But the reality is those things are colliding right now. And particularly when you start to look at the way organisations are thinking of structuring. In the UK, again, we've just recently seen quite a hike in employer national insurance responsibilities, adding heftily to their wage bill. And then, of course, we've had the recent, literally come into force today as we're recording, the tariffs. By the time this goes to air, hopefully things will have stabilised. But we just don't know where it's going to change the landscape and the economy. And I could see being a bit skeptical about this. I can see there's a risk that employers can see that being time they can claw back and go for that third avenue that you talked about, where it's a reduction in time and a reduction in money, because it's a way of keeping people employed potentially, and another route to avoid redundancy scenario in their organisation. Just no answers on this, just putting it out there with you really, Charlotte, what your thoughts are on what that might change in what you're seeing through your reports and how you might need to change keeping the study going.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. I feel there have been kind of three distinct phases to the study in terms of what's motivated employers to consider a 4-day week. And I would say in our first wave of 2022 going into 2023, this was sort of post-COVID. There had been the experiment in home working and hybrid working, which had shown that you can do big things, you can dream big, and you can make big changes. And I think that gave people the bravery to consider other complementary pieces of organisational change. And coming out of COVID, I was hearing lots of employers say, this just feels like the right thing to do because I care about staff wellbeing. And I'm really curious to see what productivity benefits we can get. But I'm interested in the staff wellbeing side of things. And then we moved into the cost of living crisis, where employers were finding it difficult to be able to give people pay rises at a time that their staff were feeling the pinch financially. And especially for the smaller employers whose own costs were rising and just couldn't give those pay rises, they were saying, okay, well, I'd like to do something for staff and I've got an eye on retention as well. I can't give pay rises, but I could do this, especially if we can find the efficiencies to get it all done in 20% less time. And now we're in 2025 and I'm seeing a new wave and a new shift in motivation where this is about thinking, okay, we need to find efficiencies. More than at any point in those previous years, we've got to find a way to get more done in less time because we've just got fewer people resources. And so here it's the adoption of technologies like AI, but it's also, I would say this, I'm a psychologist, the behavior change side of things where people need to really come in and crack on and be focused. And to do that, that means potentially reassessing the way that you're working yourself. And it means behaviour change. And we know that behaviour change is hard. You've mentioned, Sarah, about plasticity. It takes cognitive effort to reformulate those synapses and break our work habits. So I'm referring to things like how frequently do we check emails? It's easy to procrastinate and browse through emails as opposed to getting on with a tough task. But there's a behaviour change that will help you be more productive in terms of outputs by cracking on with those tasks and minimizing kind of procrastination activities. But just giving staff the time management training by itself may only get you so far. And I think that's where the motivation for the 4-day week is coming in, recognizing that dual mechanism of enhancing performance by giving people a carrot to engage in some of that behavior change, and by giving them the rest time and the boost to brain function that engenders, so that when they are at work, they're really firing on all cylinders. I think that's where the motivation is in 2025, that we need to get more done in less time. And paradoxically, the 4-day week may help us do that because we put staff in a brain state that is primed to excel.
I really agree with that. I think that's so true. But I'm sitting here also thinking about relationships. And we know that the brain is the key organ of relationships, basically. And because of what we're going through economically and what we're seeing going on all around us, whether people are going to feel another pressure coming into work to, okay, I'm working 4 days a week, so I'm going to have my day off. But so much more is now expected of me because of all these different factors. And for me, again, as a scientist, neuroscientist, it's going to be really interesting to see when you do those scans again, whether there's, growth in the amygdala, what's kind of actually happening in the brain around that.
Yeah, so I think the way that we'll approach that analytically is because we're not just getting brain scanning data from our participants, they're gifting us this amazing wealth of information about the journey that they're going on. So we've also got their performance ratings on how they've been getting on at work. And so one of the pieces of analyses we want to do down the line is to start combining all these different types of data to understand what are the mechanisms of that improved productivity? Do we see a correlation between the change in amygdala function and an increase in productivity? And is it those people who show the greatest change in amygdala function who saw that acceleration in terms of outputs and performance.
So excited.
And I'm also, me at my practical level, thinking, you've already mentioned the different stages of appetite for going into the study, how you're going to capture those nuances that you've just talked through, but also keep some consistency so that as it continues, you've got the thread sort of hanging across the whole study. How do you protect that consistency?
Yeah, so the key criteria that runs through the whole of the study is a meaningful reduction in time at work with no loss of salary. But how that is interpreted and how that plays out is different in every employer, because the nature of everyone's work is different. And so we do record lots of supplementary information about people's job roles, about the sector of the organisation. And so that will enable us in the analysis to take an overarching view of, well, what happens on average across all of the employers who have come from different sectors, different types of work, but they've all had some time off work, and then start feeding in some of those factors to understand in more detail about the different types of journey that those different employers and even different staff within the same employer are going on. And so that's why 3 years on, we're still going with data collection. You know, we've got a wealth of data already. And ironically, I'll be kept very busy analysing and writing what we already have. But some of these questions are so important and so fascinating to tease apart that we do need that larger sample size to start to stratify and dig down into some of those questions about the different journeys people have gone on, but also, as you say, Tracy, the different motivations that the employers have had coming in. And we do record that in an end of trial questionnaire for the business leader. What were your motivations going in? What outcomes were you seeking, and have those been realised? And so that will again enable us to tease that out in further analyses.
Charlotte, one thing you haven't mentioned, and I have to come clean that I've been to a couple of your presentations, is the profitability. People can sit here saying, well, productivity goes up, but what about profitability? Does that suffer? And I think I'm right in saying that it doesn't suffer, does it?
No, so on the national trial of 2022, revenue pretty much remained stable. I think it was a tiny increase of 1% or that order of magnitude. And for those that we've worked with on the Sussex programme, not all of them have tracked revenue or sent it to us to analyse, because we do work with employers on a custom basis to identify what are your key performance indicators, and it's only some of them that have shared their revenue data as a key performance indicator. But for those that we have studied, generally with one exception, it's got better during the trial period. And for our one employer where it declined, that was partly due to a seasonal effect that's well known in their industry. So I would say it's one of a suite of measures to consider, because you want to make sure that this isn't falling off a cliff. You know, it's going to be a big red flag of if profitability is going down, but it can at least be a reassurance that it doesn't decrease. Yeah.
And so I guess that leads me into, as these studies continue to have weight and more analysis to share, what do you hope it will do to perhaps not just the SMEs, but also those larger organisations, and maybe that culture within countries of the working life of our working adults?
Firstly, I hope that by providing some scientific data on what's actually happening for people, that's maybe useful to employers. At the moment, this is being led by SMEs in the private sector. Hopefully our data is useful to explain what's going on and give some inspiration on what could be possible. But there's been very little movement on this in the public sector. And we know that lots of public sector colleagues, let's take the NHS as an example, are really struggling in terms of workload. I think public sector could really benefit, but there's a financial implication there potentially. I think my role as a scientist is to provide some of the objective data on, well, this is what could happen and why. More widely, I think it's important to be part of a societal conversation around what do we want to do as a society, and shifts in social norms, essentially. If we look back to Victorian times, it was normal to work 6 days a week. You might have Sunday off to go to church if you were lucky. And then over many decades, and it was decades, this wasn't an overnight shift, but over that time, there was a shift in social norms for what we considered to be, quotes, a full-time working week. And we're now in 2025. We're not in 1950 anymore, where, at least for some middle-class families, there was someone at home taking care of domestic duties. So I think the 4-day week is part of that wider societal conversation on how do we enable great quality of life in a thriving economy, which is bigger than we can answer, the three of us here.
Feels like your study's grown some legs there.
Yeah, but such an important conversation to be had.
Yeah,
really,
well, that's
really
why we wanted to
important.
get you on, because
Yeah,
I think the biggest, and I'm not surprised at the early stage of your studies, there was just this genuine interest for well-being, because I think that was sitting so closely to the pandemic, and we immediately went into how can we carry on functioning as an organisation, but look after our people and keep them safe and make sure that we protect them from this disease. So it's interesting how quickly, only 5 years, we've moved on, forgotten about that, and we're now back into productivity, efficiency, and this very sort of disassociated language from that nurturing, caring employer thinking. So it's fascinating how quickly we move on.
oh God, yeah, we are. But I think that's one thing that stays around is that was happening before the pandemic, when I was doing, well-being is such a huge area, but it actually was all about preventative well-being, about making sure that people's brain care and physical care was being looked after. And so I think that is still important in the 4-day week, because what you're demonstrating is that there is a mental well-being that's very, very important, which is preventative. And I think that's got to stay that's an important part of the whole dialogue, because we know, as you're saying, the NHS is stretching beyond what it's capable of. But if we can prevent all of these things happening, then that scenario changes as well.
Absolutely. And it's preventative in multiple senses, because it's preventative in terms of that person's own future well-being, but it's also preventative in terms of avoiding the possibility of productivity declines. It's preventative for attrition and losing key staff. NHS is a good example there. It's preventative. It's insulating yourself as an employer from losing good people and impaired performance because people are tired.
And also long-term sickness through mental illness. Because people are over capacity in their brain. They're struggling to think, and they're stressed, and they're going off work with stress. And so if we can put some balance back into that without it impeding productivity, that's going to hit a critical. Let's hope it doesn't hit a critical point before we start to move along that social landscape change, as you were describing earlier. It's interesting how you brought in the Victorian period and how what the new social norms are. So I suppose, in short, what you're hoping is we start to see some input towards that social norm shift that we're seeing in our country and worldwide. What I'm just wondering, because we've chatted our way around how the study came together, who's been involved, what you're finding, what their benefits have been, where it might go next. What's the most important thing that you think our listeners should take away from our conversation today?
So, we've been talking a lot about the 4-day week, but this is something that only a minority of staff in the UK or even around the world have or have the potential to access anytime soon. So I hope some of our findings might be interesting and useful for people more generally in terms of understanding that tight link between well-being and performance at work. And if we just take the default mode as an example, we touched earlier, Soraya, on that benefit of the lunchtime walk. You don't need to have a 4-day week to engage the default mode network. It can be as short and as simple as a 10-minute walk at lunchtime. And we know from the scientific evidence that engages the default mode network. And that then enables you to come back to the desk with, your list that you talked about earlier, and then putting in a drawer. Whilst that's in the drawer, your brain is unconsciously solving that list for you, but you need to go on the lunchtime walk to create that brain space for that unconscious work of your brain to come into your consciousness. So you can absolutely take some of the elements of our research and our findings into your daily working life and daily practices on a more micro level.
Lovely. We have some mandatory questions, don't we, Tracy, that we
do.
Always ask our guests.
Take the lead on those. Go on, sorry.
Yeah, because we want to kind of create just as we're doing here now, wellbeing and talk about the 4-day week, we want to create a kind of a resource for people to kind of use within their organizations for the environment and the culture and people's well-being, their long-term well-being. So one question we have is, what can leaders do to create joy and laughter amongst their teams? Because we know how important that is.
Yeah, absolutely. So how I approach this is on a weekly basis. I catch up usually on an individual level, but sometimes on a team level with my team members who have been busy in the mines of science, running analysis, conducting statistical tests, making graphs of our data, and finding out what's really going on with the 4-day working week. And they're working very hard doing that. And some of the tasks can be quite hard going, doing computer programming to run the statistical tests or running all the MRI scans. Each person that we see is different, but we need to repeat the same processes each time, and it's quite time consuming. So it's hard work. It's exciting, but it's hard work. And so when I see them, I'm coming to the data fresh. They've been working on it for a week, but then they show me a graph of how the default mode changes from pre to post on the trial. And I'm so excited. Some people might perceive it to be perhaps unprofessional to show that exuberance and that excitement, but I can't contain it. So I say, oh, I'm so excited. Oh, this feels like a real milestone. Oh, this is wonderful to see. Aren't you excited too? And I try not to limit that joy and just to let that joy bubble over.
That's wonderful because it's addictive. So that's a brilliant thing to be doing. You're really looking after their brain health already. And my other question is, as a thought leader, what is your leadership secret?
So I'm going to, of course, refer it back to wellbeing and productivity again, and the link between the two. And I've got an example of this, which has happened just recently, that a member of my team needed my help, basically, needed me to step in and help out with some of their work. And this was a bit short notice, a bit unexpected. And it meant that I had to put down a key task that I'd been hoping to work on in order to cover their work, essentially. And at the time, internally, I was a bit frustrated that I was having to put down another task of my own that I'd been hoping to make some progress on in order to make sure that her work was covered. But when I took a step back and reflected on it, I thought, no, this is absolutely the protective thing. We talked about protective mechanisms earlier. This is a protective thing for her long-term productivity and my long-term productivity to ensure that she's looked after and not overworked. Because if I don't step in and help there's a risk there that she might become much less productive longer term because she may just check out, the motivation will go down. If I help her feel that she's being supported, she'll stay on board in terms of helping out as a team player. And if that person ended up resigning, well, that would significantly impact my long-term productivity, where I'm then going to have to go through a replacement hiring process. So it was a very small, short-term productivity hit for me to protect the long-term productivity for herself, for myself, for the team.
That's wonderful. I just hope more leaders think like you, because it is the long term, isn't it? It's really caring for the people around you, which inevitably will, in the long term, helps you as well. Cares for you.
I think that's a really powerful one to add to our ever-growing list.
Yeah, it is.
In business today, like you said, we're time poor as well. The efficiencies are being squeezed. the metrics that are being placed on leaders as well as their teams are becoming tighter controlled. And so just like we struggle to think logically and critically, we tend to move into short-term thinking, not long-term thinking. And that impacts better decision making. And you've just described that beautifully there. So thank you for that. Yeah. Brilliant example. Now, I know the study's still live, and I know one of the things that we can give back to you for your time today is you can let people know. We can definitely put it in. So when you go to our website under the guest page, we can have the link through. But is there anything you want to say about people getting in touch with you, Charlotte?
Thanks so much. Yeah, so the Sussex Four-Day Week study is very much still open. As I mentioned, we want to get that larger sample size to tease out these additional really interesting questions. And you can actually take part either as a 4-day week employer, or you can take part as what we call a control employer. This is where you stay on your current working patterns, but we would still like to monitor well-being, productivity, and brain function. And we do everything with our control employers that we do with our 4-day week employers, with the advice and training on productivity, and a report with a health check on how your staff getting on in terms of well-being and performance, but just with no change to working hours. So if you would like a brain scan, then do get in touch with us. And I should say, you don't have to be based in Sussex either, just a UK-based employer. So you can take a look at our website. That's www.sussexfourdayweek.co.uk, and that's 4-day week with a number 4, and you can find our details there.
That's accessible on the website as well. And I'm not a scientist. I'm becoming a neuroscientist, but I'm not a scientist. But I am fascinated. I'd love to go reveling through. I get excited about brain activity changes as well. I wouldn't be able to contain myself either.
It's fantastic. Thanks, Charlotte. Thank you so much.
Enjoyed this episode? Listen to more at brainycasts.com.